So welcome to our webinar, everyone, and 10 Ways to Protect Your Organization from Food Fraud, presented by Bryan Neal. Bryan is our technical manager for SAI Global for a number of different food standards. He has 15 years experience in the food industry. He's a member of the certification body committee for SQF and an auditor as well for SQF, as well as a number of other food safety standards. Wealth of information. I'm very pleased to welcome Bryan to our presentation today. With that, Bryan, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you. And away we go.
Okay, good. Thank you, Holly. Holly, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, you're good. Thank you.
Okay, good. So with that, get rid of this. Okay, wonderful. So on our agenda today, we're going to talk about food fraud, of course, some of the definitions that have been put out there, the impacts of food fraud, some of the high-risk areas, tips for risk mitigation, and using your certification to support the mitigating food fraud risks. So I'll just get right in. Produce product. Okay. So just real quick, a little background. So food safety, food defense, and food fraud risk consider different criteria in order to determine the degree of this is a little umbrella, a food safety management system umbrella, and everything that kind of falls in that umbrella, as you can see here. So within your food safety management system, you have these three areas. You have HACCP, which is food safety. You have TACCP, which is food defense, and you have VACCP, which is food fraud. So HACCP kind of covers hazards, things that can make people sick unintentionally. Food defense covers threats. So that is someone trying to hurt your customers, your clients, your company, things like that intentionally. And food fraud is something that the company or someone does for economic gain to make more money from the product. So that's kind of the three areas that now your food safety management system has to encompass. Okay. So now with the GFSI guidance document 7, food fraud is a requirement, as everyone should know. And this is a definition that they have put into their guidance document. So I'm just going to read it word for word here so you can kind of see it. A collective tampering or term encompassing the deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, misrepresentation of food ingredients, or food packaging, labeling, product information, or false or misleading statements made about a product for economic gain that could impact consumer health. So the main thing here is it's for economic gain that could impact consumer health. And later on, I'll show you some examples of those exact consumer health things that have happened. Okay. A couple other definitions. So the top one is pretty much what we just talked about, except the word dilution has been added to it. So it says addition or dilution. So they're adding a different ingredient into what they're saying it is, or they're diluting it down so it's not as strong, but they're selling it as what it is. And here's another one. Intentional deception using food. Thing with food fraud is somebody's doing something to that product for money, more money. So selling you something that it isn't. Okay. Next, where does a food fraud appear? Counterfeiting. So someone taking your product and making it their own. Maybe if you make something here in Missouri, for example, in the United States, back in, let's say, Russia or China, someone else is taking that product and reverse engineering it and making it and labeling it as your product, but they're selling it and making that money. So as we talk about dilution, substitution, contamination, do something with it to go ahead and sell it off. Or maybe it's food fraud is because of tampering. Where you might see food fraud or examples of food fraud in the food industry. Okay. All right, so on to the requirements of what GFSI says you have to have. Okay, GFSI says for food fraud, you must have a food fraud vulnerability assessment and strategy, and that should include a written procedure, an annual assessment, or after each incident occurs. You must address all types of risks, and not just inside your walls, inside your facility, but outside. So what's going to happen to that product before and after it's in your building? And address all products, and that means your raw material, your packaging, your finished goods. And back up to the top for written procedure. That doesn't mean it has to be a huge, elaborate document or procedure, as long as your written procedure covers what you needed to cover to kind of protect your company and your products. And again, it doesn't have to be a 100-page manual, as long as it does. Okay. Okay, so here's an example for you. So let's say a food fraud incident occurs. Let's say your product is sold for something that it isn't. So, you know, something was added, or it was, you say it's one thing, but it's actually something else. What do you do next? So an investigation occurs. That means you should do an investigation inside your company, and also somebody from the external, like a government, for example, is going to be doing their own investigation to see what happened and kind of get down to see, you know, the root cause of it. So there will be 2 investigations. You should definitely do your own to find the root cause and see what happened. And like as I said, the government agency or the client, someone else will be doing it as well. And during that investigation, you're going to ask, did it pass our inspection process? And that means within your processing steps, with your quality checks or your lab work, whatever you do to determine that product is safe to ship out. What inspection? Did you identify a countermeasure? So do it during your vulnerability assessment. Did you determine that process step needed to have a countermeasure? That product needed to have a countermeasure. Okay, and how did you justify it not needing a preventive control? So preventive control, of course, is FSMA term. So if you're doing your risk assessment and you determine it needs a preventive control in place, you put that in place. And let's say this right here, you've determined it didn't need one. Well, why not? So you have to look at all these things after an incident occurs, and that means whenever you do your assessment, because an incident occurred, you do all these steps right here to help make your program more robust. Okay, your prevention strategy. So here's what we do to start out the whole food fraud plan. You have to develop a team first. So similar to what you do for HACCP, you have a HACCP team. And this food fraud team must be cross-functional as well. So you want to take somebody from HR, for example, from IT, areas of your company, to make sure you collect all of the risks. Sorry about that. And then you want to design a policy statement or a mission statement, food fraud policy or mission statement, however you want to word that. Similar to your food safety policy, but it's for food fraud, and put that within your plan. Conduct the vulnerability assessment, and that's where you go through each step of your process, inside and outside of your building, to make sure you collect all those risks. Review those vulnerabilities. So the vulnerabilities you identify through the assessment, you need to review those. Okay. Consider countermeasures or preventive controls for those higher risk vulnerabilities. So as you review those vulnerabilities, you assign risks to them. And we'll look at that here in a few minutes. And with those higher risk items, that's where you give them countermeasures or preventive controls to help bring those back in. And after you have those top things kind of considered and out of the way, you do training for your personnel. That could be for your personnel within your building, or your clients, your suppliers, to make sure they're doing what they should be doing. So every part of your food chain, you need to make sure it's covered for your company. And then after all that, implement your strategy, and then you have your annual assessment, or after each incident. So that's one thing important to remember. Your assessment must be each year or after each incident. Same with, HACCP, after there's things you have to do your assessment to make sure everything's covered. Okay.
Thanks, Brian. Sorry,
so I believe this was a poll question. Holly, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in and run this poll. So let me launch it here and I'll speak to the question. So what is your greatest challenge in addressing food fraud? So I'll launch it here and invite you to select your response. So perhaps it's developing a robust food fraud plan. Perhaps it's the confidence in your supplier compliance program, or perhaps it's the traceability within your supply chain. So what is your greatest challenge? I'll leave it open for about 15 more seconds here. What's your expectation, Brian? What do you think most folks would say would be the greatest challenge?
I would say the biggest challenge from what I've seen to this point in 2018 is the food fraud plan. Just figuring out what should be in there, how to manage that in your system. I would say that's the biggest challenge currently.
Yeah, looks like we're trending that way. So let me close and share the results here. Yeah, 59%. Followed by 27% supplier compliance program, but definitely the food fraud plan was the greatest challenge.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of to go with this, talk about the food fraud plan. That's probably the most important thing. And then, you have to be able to trust your suppliers that they're doing the right thing. So they have to have programs in place and give those assurances to you. And then traceability. Can you trace it? Not only where it's going or where you ship it to, but where has your raw materials been before it got to you. So that's also something definitely important to consider. All right, now we get into some food fraud examples. Everyone has heard about food fraud in the news within the last few years, but we're just going to talk about some of those. And some of these, like I said, you've probably heard of, but just refreshers to see some differences. So as you can see here, food fraud has been going back years and years, from the 18th and 19th century, from spices, whenever people would substitute different things into spice. To make it look like water or to dilute it down. More recently, I'm sure everyone is aware of this, the horse meat thing that happened, where they did some testing of some burgers, and they found that it wasn't all beef in those burgers. As you can see on the bottom slide, one sample contained 29% horse meat. Of the 27 burgers tested, they had pork in it also. So this was a good example of where they labeled it as beef hamburgers. It had horse meat. The horse meat's a bigger issue for people because it's not a commonly eaten item. But this is a good example that was in the news pretty big. Okay, so here's one right here that we talked about with the GFSI definition. It talked about could impact consumer health. And this is definitely a good example of something that could infect consumer health, where in China in 2008, they added melamine to infant formula. And that was to elevate the protein levels. So it looked like it was really good, high quality infant formula to give to your babies, but in reality, it was something that could definitely make them sick. So that was something that was caught, luckily. But that's a huge thing right there, where GFSI took one of these for example and said we need to include that consumer health bit in there because this one definitely fits that description. Okay, the next one as well, this one as well, where it's a consumer health because peanut, tainted cumin, that's, as everyone knows, peanut's a pretty big allergen in the world, and lots of people can get sick even if they just smell it. So this is where one of the largest recalls in U.S. history had to do with this, where there was peanut powder in the cumin as an undeclared allergen. And again, another consumer health thing. And real quick, another one that just a story. I was watching a show yesterday about honey. China produces more honey than it can sell to the U.S. because U.S. has put additional tariffs on Chinese honey because they were selling it so cheap into the U.S. So now China can't ship it over here because it costs them too much money. And so they're selling it to other countries who is then turning around and selling it to the U.S. as their own honey, when in reality it's Chinese honey. So there was a big scandal just a few years ago. Started investigating a company from Russia that was doing this, and 2 people were arrested from a firm here in the U.S. that were selling Chinese honey as Russian honey. So again, that's something else where honey's another big example of this happening. It's not so much a health risk, but just food fraud. Okay. So food fraud prevention, this is what everybody cares about. So first, conduct your vulnerability assessment. And we'll talk about some examples of those here in a few minutes. So you need to target all types of food within your system. Implement a documented food fraud prevention strategy, which we kind of spoke about. Conduct an annual food fraud incident review, or if you do your review today and next week you have an incident, you have to do another review because obviously there's a gap in your system somewhere that needs to be found and corrected. And then confirm coverage for the scope of all products, including both incoming and outgoing. So the incoming would be your raw materials, your packaging, your ingredients, things like that you need to consider in this plan. And out and after. Okay, so conducting this assessment. So we're going to look at some key terms and elements, methodologies that are available across the industry, and some references. So some helpful tools for everyone when they're looking at this, because it is a new term and kind of daunting for some people. Okay, so traceability challenges. Food fraud vulnerability. It's the susceptibility or exposures to a gap or deficiency that could place consumer health at risk and or have an economic or reputational impact on food companies' operations if not addressed. So the big thing here, you're doing this vulnerability is a gap. As I talked about, you do those assessments, which we'll talk about there, to find those gaps. So those vulnerabilities are gaps in your system that could either cause economic gain, hurt the company, or hurt the consumer. So the food fraud assessment, you do those assessments to catch those gaps, those vulnerabilities. So the food fraud assessment information on potential food fraud risk factors, as well as mitigation measures, which, when combined, determine the actual fraud vulnerability. So you do that assessment to determine the vulnerabilities or the gaps in your system, which could cause a vulnerability in your system. Okay. So the mitigation measures, they are hard and soft actions that are taken to combat against identified food fraud vulnerabilities. So the vulnerabilities you identify during your assessment, that's what these mitigation measures are, to help take those away, help eliminate them in your system. Okay. So some methodologies across the industry. We have VASIP. It's the Vulnerability Assessment Critical Control Point, which is SSAFE. We'll talk about here in a few minutes. Vulnerability assessment, there's a BRC method, because BRC has been doing food fraud for a few years now, or FSSC are just now doing them with the new GFSI documents. And the vulnerability assessment here, PwC. So VASIP is going to be the most widely used one here. We're just going to talk about it. So VASIP, Vulnerability Assessment Critical Control Point. So similar to HACCP, as you see, where it's hazard analysis, but this is vulnerability assessment. So conduct a vulnerability assessment using the HACCP concept. So you do everything similar to HACCP, but it's vulnerability assessment for your food fraud program. So TACCP and VASIP. TACCP is threat assessment. Go hand in hand. So TACCP is used for food defense. Go hand in hand in the quest to demonstrate product authenticity. Both are designed to prevent the intentional adulteration of food. So TACCIP identifies the threat of behaviorally or economically motivated adulteration. VASIP identifies how vulnerable various points in the supply chain are to the threat of economically motivated adulteration. More around food defense, VASIP is for food fraud. Okay, so the risk that we talk about, so you identify the risk during your assessment. So you identify those vulnerabilities, then you put risks associated to those vulnerabilities, and you can do it however you want to, however you want to identify the risk in those vulnerabilities, and then after you plot them on your chart or however you do those, that's when you assign those countermeasures to those preventive controls to those higher risk items. Okay, some tools. So these are all tools useful to help you with these assessments. You have 4 on the screen. I would say the most widely used currently is the S-Safe one. It's a free tool that's out there for everyone to use. Let people know the S-Safe is out there for you to use for free. Okay, so just some useful websites for you guys. Everyone should go in there. Like I said, the FDA even has one. S-Safe is a free tool. Just go to the website. It's got everything there. There's a lot of useful links and data and all that fun stuff. So who is S-Safe? They are a nonprofit organization. So it is nonprofit membership driven. They foster continuous improvement and global acceptance of internationally recognized food protection systems and standards. In 2015, back when BRC kind of started doing the food fraud, they launched a free vulnerability assessment tool. It is available in Excel, on the web, and also as an app. So you just go to their website, and all of that stuff is right there for you to use. It's very handy. Okay. So the scope is a systematic process of assessing the vulnerabilities to food fraud. And again, it's used by businesses across the food supply chain. So anybody that does anything with food can go to this website and use this tool. Supports implementation of GFSI requirements, provides a profile of the company, potential food fraud vulnerability, basis for developing specific interventions to mitigate identified vulnerabilities. Used to assess vulnerability to fraud. So it talks about your ingredients, your products, your brand, everything in there. It helps you assess all of those different areas that could be at risk. And of course, as it says in the bottom, it changes over time. So year to year, that's why you need to do that assessment, at least yearly, because things change. It's like as it says there, a living tool. It's just a beast that keeps getting bigger as the industry grows and as the industry changes. You have to be aware of those and grow with those changes. Okay. So who, where, what, when? It could be any business in the food that is food, so farm to fork. So that food fraud could occur anywhere through who's ever selling that honey. So it affects everyone. As I talked about, it affects your products, your ingredients, your brand, your site. And so encompasses everything at your company before and after your company also. So you need to ask the questions. Who has motivations, opportunities? You need to think like the person that's going to do this. Put yourself in their shoes to help you determine, the vulnerabilities and do this assessment tool. So what? Identify the areas. Structured assessments on a regular basis. And again, you can do it more often than annually, of course, to help you identify those risks that you may have forgotten. Do it quarterly, monthly, biannually. Just as long as you have a robust system that kind of covers your company. So part of the assessment tool is the decision tree. It has the questions. You have your spider webs, preparation of control plans. So it has all these different tools in place to make sure you get. And as I mentioned, I'm talking about this in detail because it's definitely a widely used tool, and it's very helpful and very useful for you guys to go out there, get easily. I mean, they've made it easy for you to obtain. As I said, it's even on an app. Mitigation plan. You have your mitigation plan. Investigate methods for improving the company's traceability system. Prepare a code of ethics and guidelines. You need to have a whistleblowing system so people are not afraid if they see something on the production floor, or if they're out and about and they see something, not afraid to raise their hand and say, hey, there's a problem. So you need to have that system in place to protect those employees. Review your contracts with your suppliers. It says future, but not only future, but your previous, just to make sure, your current. You need to make sure those contracts cover all these food fraud vulnerabilities, and your suppliers are covered as well, and they're ensuring that you, of course, request your suppliers are meeting this assessment as well. See their vulnerability assessment, see where they have found those vulnerabilities, and see how they have addressed those. Part of your supplier approval program. Prepare the contingency plan, business continuity plan, and provide managers with crisis management training. So through this mitigation plan, you need to kind of look at all these areas and further develop these areas. So further develop your supplier approval program, your business continuity plan, all based on that mitigate. It's all part of the mitigation plan. So food fraud can impact all these areas. Okay. So vulnerability is identified. Adulteration. I mean, everyone's kind of sees that. And as I mentioned, whistleblowing. It's a very important system to have in place, because if employees see someone on the floor and they're afraid to come forward with it, they're not going to come forward. They may quit. They may let it just keep going by because they're afraid to raise their hand and go to somebody and say, hey, there's a problem. Or, because they need that job to continue supporting their family. Direct suppliers, product monitoring control. So that's within your systems. You have QA checks in place. And employee screening, because employee screening is also a very important part, because you got to know who's coming to your building, check their backgrounds. Okay, so we talked about all these things. Here's some of the guidance documents. And again, this will be available on a recorded session, so you guys can have these. If you're not able to document these right away, you'll be able to have these links handy to you. So again, the big one, it's all because of GFSI, and it's a good. GFSI has kind of required this now. All right, so we started out. This is 10 ways to protect against food fraud. That's the this is fraud. So here are the 10 questions, or the 10 tidbits, I guess we kind of talked about. So understanding the difference between HACCP, VACCP, and TACCP. As I spoke about, HACCP is food safety. Everyone should have your HACCP plan in place. If not, then you need to get that in place before you kind of move forward, because HACCP, everything kind of revolves around HACCP, your food safety management system, in relation to HACCP. VACCP is the vulnerability assessment critical control point. That's food fraud. And TACCP are the threat assessment critical control point. That's more food defense. So I talked about that umbrella. So your food safety management system, underneath that umbrella are these 3 key areas that you need to think about and consider. Because if one of them fails, your food safety management system is going to fail. Identify the requirements to address food fraud. Ensure commitment from senior management. So just with anything else, with HACCP, for example, or anywhere in your food safety management system, or your GFSI program, whatever your program you're certified in, if you do not have commitment from those senior management personnel, then everything's going to fall apart, because one person can't hold it together. It has to be a company commitment from top down. So that's where the training comes in, and that's where you just have to have those things in place. Use your HACCP concepts to conduct this food. Conduct a vulnerability assessment to identify supply chain risks. And as I mentioned, in your assessment, it says supply chain risk. So that means forward and backwards. So not only in your four walls, or however many walls you have, in your building, and not only forward, where it went, but where it came from. As you saw, farm to fork. So everything in between farm to fork, you need to kind of think about when you're doing these assessments. Document that food mitigation plan. Documentation, record keeping, it's all important. If it's not written down, it didn't happen, it's not in place. Implement those control measures. So as you do your assessments, as you do your mitigation plans, those vulnerabilities you identify, you need to implement those control measures that you identify, the vulnerabilities you have in place. You have to have those control measures in place, those preventive controls in place to help eliminate those risks in your system. Not only in your building, but before and after, through supplier management, through whatever you put in place to mitigate those risks. As I talked about, if you don't have record of these things happening, of your assessments, of your annual assessments, of those things, then you can't prove it didn't happen, and you can't prove you're covered. And you're just putting yourself at risk. And again, conduct regular audits to ensure compliance. And that audit is to your system. So your internal audit program, you will audit your food fraud system to ensure that it still can catch these risks and these vulnerabilities, and everything's kind of covered within your plan. Okay. And continue to evaluate your policies, processes, and plans. And this just continuous. So just like with HACCP, you have your HACCP annual assessment, you have your food defense assessment. All these things, you need to make sure food fraud, food fraud is a big deal, as you saw from some of those examples, and it can occur at any step of your process. In your system, you could have an employee committing the food fraud, you could have the president of the company committing food fraud, so it could be anybody within your system. So make sure you continually evaluate those systems to ensure you're covered and there's not any gaps in your system. Okay, good. So Holly, I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
That's great. Thanks, Bryan. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions here. So I'll just remind everyone that we have recorded today's webinar. You'll receive a link to the recording as well as the slide deck within 2 business days. And we invite you to connect with us. You can see on your screen here how to do that. So Bryan, I'm going to read you a couple of questions, and then I invite you to give your feedback here. All right. So do you have any suggestions on how to handle this issue of food fraud from a food packaging manufacturer standpoint?
Yeah, so you have to do the exact same thing. We had just recently an auditor asked me the same question. He was doing an SQF audit, a packaging supplier, and he says, well, their packaging, they don't have any risks. So you have to still do the vulnerability assessment forward, where you get nothing's contaminated it, and it is what it is. Forward also. So it's a very tough question how to tell you a packaging supplier to do this, but you do those assessments. You see if there's any gaps, any vulnerabilities, and if not, then there's not, and you have it written in your plan, and you can move on. And if you don't have an identified risk, same with CCPs, for example. If you don't identify CCPs in your system, then you don't have any risks involved. And as long as you feel comfortable with that, then you're okay, and you can prove it.
Okay. This question's from Christina. What would be the food fraud example for paper bag and wrap production? Well, we pretty well just touched on this in the packaging side, but I guess identifying that there aren't any risks is doing the work, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and so it just goes with plastics, for example, making sure your raw materials aren't contaminated or are what they say they are. So it be that through test results. And paper bag, yeah, there's not much risk identified there, but it's all through your risk assessment, your vulnerability assessment.
Yep. Okay. This question is from Kent. How do I
have this plan in place?
Oh, I beg your pardon, Bryan. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. This question is from Kent. On the 10 ways on our list of suggestions, so one of the points was identify requirements, the requirements to address food fraud. Can you just give some context on how to do that?
Yeah, so identify the requirements to address food fraud, and that would be requirements within your system. So you identify those requirements through doing those assessments. and that's where you put that mitigation plan in place, your strategy. What do you need in your system to control those vulnerabilities, be it preventive controls, be it those whatever those countermeasures are? Those will be the requirements to identify to address food fraud in your system. What do you need to put in place with those gaps, if there are any gaps? And if not, that's fine, you've identified them, as long as you can stick to that and prove it.
Yeah, okay. This question is from Brad. Is food fraud in scope for a warehouse only operation? Warehouse only.
Definitely could be at a warehouse, because you could have an employee or anyone in your system going out there and relabeling something in your warehouse. Let's say you get something, a low-end product, and they relabel it as a high-end product. So that's definitely could be a risk, especially if the warehouse owns the finished goods. There could be a risk there, because someone could be, like I said, relabeling it, repackaging it. They could be doing something with that to commit that food fraud for economic gain. So you definitely have to conduct those assessments in a warehouse as well.
Okay. This is a good question. Are you able to utilize the current food defense program to cover the food fraud aspect as well?
You definitely can have a food defense food fraud program, but you need to make sure they're specific to those areas. So one needs to, you have to specifically address food defense, and you have to specifically address food fraud. For example, in SQF, as everyone knows in Edition 8, they have food defense section and they have a food fraud section with all the different questions. So it has to, if that's how you want to design it, you can design it that way, as long as it's separate within the program and you identify those risks separately, because they are separate risks. Food defense carries different risks. For example, so you can have it all combined, call it a food defense food fraud program, but you have to identify those things separately within your program.
Okay. This question is from April. How do you base the decision on if there is risk with an ingredient? There seems to be a lot of opinion in this area.
Yeah, so with your ingredients coming to your facility, of course, a lot of that you have to rely on your suppliers. You have your supplier approval program in place. Maybe they give you a COA, said here's everything that's in our product, be it salt or pepper or whatever it may be. But you also have to, if you don't trust that, or if you want to go a step further, send it out for testing. For example, going back to the honey, I don't know why, maybe I need some honey. You go back to the honey, they had COAs coming into the US saying it was from Russia or from Hungary or whatever country it was. But when they did the testing on the actual honey, it tested Chinese honey. So the COA showed one thing, but when when it was imported in the US, customs or whoever, so yeah, you definitely need to trust your suppliers, and you could put that in place, that they have to have these assessments in place as well, similar to what you have in place, and they should, to identify those risks. But you could go a step further and test your raw material to ensure it is what they say it is.
Yeah. Okay. Is there a checklist available for an internal audit of the food fraud program?
That's a good question. I know that you can download that SSafe, go to their website, and there's lots of useful tools. There's assessments in place, and by doing those assessments on that SSafe website, it helps you audit your system. As we talked about, the mitigation plan. Do you have these things in place, and do these things cover you for food fraud? And again, same with your GFSI program. You read through those questions, and that will help you identify those gaps in your system as well.
Yeah, okay. Should food fraud be developed as a separate plan, or can it be developed as part of the food defense plan?
Yeah, like I mentioned, it can be developed as part of, because food defense, food fraud, it could go kind of hand in hand, but like I mentioned earlier, you need to specifically identify them separately within your plan. So you can have them combined, but you need to have within your plan and identify those risks separately, because they are separate risks. They're not the same. They can't be the same, because as I mentioned, food fraud is economic gain. Food defense is more someone's out to get you or get the company or get the client something, not so much for economic gain, but to cause harm. So they are completely different risks. So it's all, you need to manage it that way where you keep them separate because they are separate risks, but you can have it in the same plan. As I mentioned, there's no details around how you write your food fraud plan. It doesn't have to be a mile long. It can be 1 page or 2 page as long as it does what it needs to do.
Okay. Do you consider every process step in the process flow when documenting the vulnerability assessment, something similar to HACCP?
Yes, definitely. So as it said earlier, you use the HACCP plan to do your assessment. And that is, you have your flow chart and you go through every step of your flow in this assessment, all the way from receiving your materials through shipping. So that's how you do your assessment within your building, exactly like HACCP. And then, of course, you'll want to do before and after as well, which HACCP doesn't cover. So yeah, definitely take that flow chart to do your assessment.
Okay. Does getting ingredients or acquisition of ingredients from a GFSI supplier, can that be considered as a control measure for food fraud, the fact that they're certified?
It definitely could. And again, it's how you write your program. So if you write your program where if they're GFSI certified, then we'll accept that because you have to have a food fraud plan to be GFSI now. Any of the at least the 3 main programs, or I guess all of them, because GFSI requires it. So if you write your program that if they are GFSI certified to SQF BRC, or if you write your program, that's great, you're GFSI, but we require this as well. We want to see your assessments. We want to see your plans. So again, it's all how you write your program. And if you write your program to see all these things on an annual basis, then please do that. Because if you say each supplier must send me their plan or their assessments on an annual basis, and you're not doing it, then you're not meeting what your plan says. So it all goes back to, you can write your plan however you want to write your plan, just make sure you follow it.
Yep. Okay. Let me see here. What employee background check should a company do? Like, what are some recommendations? What information does the employer need to collect?
Yeah, so on an employee background checks, it could be a difficult thing because yeah, you do for do they have legal status to work in the U.S.? You might check criminal history, and during that criminal history, you could also check if they do have criminal history. What was that for? Mischievous act they did at that previous company. Could be through interviews. You could interview them, but it could be difficult in those employee background checks to identify, are they coming here to cause us harm or to do something for their own benefit other than pay their bills. They may be doing something other than those key aspects. So it's difficult, but the employee background checks, looking at their criminal history if you can, looking at their past employment. Maybe you have their past employment. You call those employers and say, well, why did they leave? What kind of employee were they? Things like that. It's all through just your investigation into that employee.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I just shared a screen, a slide that speaks about our training courses. There's lots of different formats of creating the plan, and we have a number of different courses that can help you build this. I thought I'd just add this in there real quick. We'll send some links in case folks are looking for training and interested, but just so you get a broad spray of what we do offer. We have one more question on, let me just see here. Can you provide some food fraud examples for potatoes in this side of the industry?
Excuse me, Holly, could you repeat that?
Yes, of course. We have a webinar attendee asking for some food fraud examples for potatoes.
Okay, so food fraud examples for potatoes. I mean, a good example of that is Idaho potatoes. You're in another state and you're selling potatoes as Idaho. How do you prove? Because it has to have that mark, that designation on it. Maybe they're actually from Texas or from wherever else grows potatoes, and someone is selling them as Idaho potato. So if you're making potato flakes, for example, or French fries, and you sell them retail and you say they're from Idaho, the Idaho potatoes, how do you know that in your system? How do you prove that those raw materials coming in are what they say they are? So yeah, the supplier says they're from Idaho, but how do you dig down deeper and know that they're exact from audit? So that's a good example of potatoes, and I've seen that before, where somebody said they're using, they label it as one thing, but it's, you know, the raw material is actually from somewhere else. Sounds minor, but it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Last question here from a webinar attendee here. So the supply chain, if your supply chain is not quite like well established, and developing a supplier compliance program has not really, you know, been a project that's been undertaken by management, how do you establish these kinds of systems of traceability and addressing the food fraud? So, you know, looking at things that the gentleman here has said, looking at things like testing, you know, genetics test for the ingredients to determine the product origin. You know, no one wants to sort of own that cost. So how do you sort of start to build your supplier compliance program to address food fraud?
Yeah, so that's really need to have that supplier approval program or the system in place. You're putting all those things in place. You look at your raw materials, and you're saying what products are higher risk, because you're prioritizing those higher risk items. And as you do these things for food fraud, all from, you know, all the things we've spoken about, it'll help you say, okay, well, for our suppliers, we need them to do this. We need this from our supplier on an annual basis. We need this on each load. On the COA, we need them to show us this. So as you do this vulnerability assessment, you identify those gaps with your raw materials or in your system. You could say, okay, well, we're going to control this through our supplier, and to do that, we need our supplier to send us this, and we need them to do this. And again, that's could be every load if you want to ensure the origin of that raw material, or it could be on an annual basis. However you, as you're doing these vulnerability assessments, and as you identify these gaps and these countermeasures you put in place, it helps you say, okay, well, now we can go backwards to our suppliers, and here's what we need from our suppliers, and here's what we need those guys to do. And then that will help you to develop that supplier approval program as well.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
And again, sorry, one more thing, Holly. So, and again, if you put it in your program, make sure you're doing it. I've seen lots of places that put it in their program, and they never read their program again, and they don't follow what they say. So always, if you say you're going to do it, do it. Thank you.
Okay. Just some feedback on the employee background check. One of the attendees made a very valuable point here. Many former employees will not reveal the kind of questions that you posed, Bryan, as examples, due to privacy concerns. So getting that sort of information is quite difficult. So you're sort of blind to this. But great point. I mean, it is what it is, but it is a good point to raise as feedback.
Definitely, thank you.
What is the best way to determine if an ingredient is at risk for food fraud in the first place? Obviously, spices and identify preserved items are higher risk, but how do you start to build, you know, and determine which other ingredients are high risk?
Yeah, definitely. So it's all goes back to that assessment where you want to look at all of your raw materials. So you look at your packaging, and we spoke about some packaging. You look at every raw material and ingredient that comes in, and during that assessment, maybe it's just 100% salt. Maybe it's a spice that's like an allspice. It's a mixed ingredient. You look at that, and while you're identifying those gaps, you identify you prioritize them on a risk chart. So like you have that chart, the higher risk items. So maybe salt isn't a high risk because you can test that pretty easily in your system. But if you have an allspice, well, how do I know that my cumin isn't actually peanut, for example? That's a higher risk item. So you identify that through that assessment by looking at every single ingredient and raw material that comes in. You can say, okay, well, let's say this one is a higher risk because there's more components in it, because it's a multi-ingredient, I guess, if you will, a spice. So it's all through that assessment. Looking at your suppliers, looking at all the ingredients that come in. Packaging may not be a high as a risk as a milk powder, for example. So it's all through. It all goes back to that assessment. It all starts with that. Getting all your products, make sure you put them through this assessment.
All right, good feedback. Thank you, Bryan. Do you have any examples of food fraud on tea?
On tea, I do not have any examples on tea. But I'm sure it's out there, and I guess it could go back to just like with anything else, going back to your raw materials. I'm not real familiar with tea, but I would guess that if tea from different parts of the world are different, just like with anything else, the way it's grown, the soil it's grown in, how it's fertilized, and then going forward, you have you have your green tea, you have all these different types of tea, finished product. So just ensuring that it is what it is, out your door and to your consumers. It's all of what it's about. So if it's coming in, it is what it is, and going out into your consumer, it is what it should be.
Yeah, okay, very good. I think that's all our questions here. That's great. Well, Bryan, thank you very much for your presentation. Thanks to everyone for attending. A reminder, we've recorded today's webinar. You'll receive a link to the recording as well as the slide deck within 2 business days. And thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.